In the winter of 1879, as other frontier widows burned every stick of wood to stay alive, Karen Locke piled broken chairs and even her mother's hope chest into the stove, but refused to touch her family piano. Neighbors whispered she'd freeze. Karen knew that piano held a secret that could save her not once, but twice, and the first time had nothing to do with music. Karen Locke arrived in the Dakota Territory 3 years earlier with a husband, a wagon of belongings, and a rosewood piano that her mother had treasured. Now, at 29, she was alone. The husband was buried beneath frozen prairie soil. Every neighbor for miles told her to sell the piano for firewood money or feed it to the flames. But Karen refused. Her mother's last words had been to guard the instrument with her life. As the winter of 1879 tightened its grip, Karen was about to discover that this piano was not just a memory. It was a locked vault holding a decision that would force her to choose between honoring her mother's dying wish and staying alive. The Dakota winter of 1879 came early that year, as if the sky itself had grown impatient. By late November, a thin crust of ice already formed on the water bucket inside the cabin before sunrise. Karen Locke had learned to sleep with her wool shawl wrapped around her head, her dog Biscuit pressed against her legs beneath the quilts. The homestead was a single room of split pine logs with a stone chimney, a glass window darkened by frost, and a narrow sleeping loft above the stove. It was the kind of place that could either shelter a family or become their coffin, depending entirely on how much wood you had stacked outside before the first freeze. Karen had not been able to stack much of anything. Her husband, John, had died of pneumonia in the final week of October, leaving behind a half-finished woodpile, a pregnant goat, and a wife who had never been taught to swing an axe. The burial had been a hurried affair. Two neighbor men dug the grave on a gray afternoon while Karen stood with her hand pressed against the rough piano case, the only thing from John's estate that remained entirely her own. The land and the cabin were his, but the piano that had come from her mother, and the law could not touch it. The coffin went into frozen ground and the men left, their boots crunching across the crusted snow. Karen watched them go, then closed the door and looked at the room around her. Two handmade chairs, a pine table, a hope chest painted with faded vines, a cast-iron stove, and the rosewood piano that seemed to swallow half the cramped space. That winter she would burn nearly all of it. The chairs went first, their dry wood cracking into heat that barely lasted an hour. The table followed in the second week of December, its thick legs feeding the stove through one bitter night of wind that shook the chimney stones loose. Each time Karen lifted a piece of furniture toward the stove door, she paused and glanced at the piano as if asking its permission. She never touched it. The hope chest was the hardest. Her mother had painted those curling green vines herself, back in Missouri, when Karen was still a girl who believed that homesteading meant adventure and wildflowers, not frostbite and empty cupboards. Inside the chest were yellowed letters, a silver thimble, a lock of her mother's hair tied with a blue ribbon. Karen removed those things, placed them in a biscuit tin, and then spent 20 minutes kneeling on the cold floor, her hand pressed flat against the painted lid, before she finally dragged the chest to the stove and fed it into the fire. That night, the cabin smelled of burning pine and old varnish, and Karen sat in the dark with her back against the piano, listening to the wind. Biscuit whimpered at her feet. She had not realized she was crying until the salt reached her lips. The settlement around her began to notice. Trail Hollow was not a town so much as a loose collection of sod houses and timber claims scattered across 5 miles of wind-scoured prairie. The nearest dry goods store was run by a man named Horace Milner, a transplanted Ohio banker who had come west chasing fortune and settled instead for selling overpriced flour and thread. Milner had heard about the piano from the men who helped bury John. One afternoon, as Karen traded 3 eggs for a small bag of cornmeal, Milner leaned across the plank counter and offered her $30 for the instrument. "A piano out here is dead weight," he said, his voice greasy with false sympathy. "You can't eat it. It won't heat your cabin. Sell it to me before the snow gets worse, and I'll put you on a wagon east come spring." Karen looked at him for a long moment, the cornmeal bag clutched in her chapped fingers. It's not for sale. Milner's smile thinned. You'll change your mind when your toes start turning black. She walked out, but his words followed her through the frozen trail, a whisper that grew louder with every step. Because she knew he was right about one thing. You couldn't burn a piano. Or rather, you could, but you'd be left with nothing but iron strings and a charred frame, and then you'd freeze anyway. The rosewood cabinet would catch fast, the ivory keys would blacken and curl, and the beautiful instrument her mother had guarded for 30 years would become ash in a single afternoon. And then what? Karen knew the answer. Then she would be utterly alone, with nothing left of her mother, nothing left of her marriage, nothing but a cold stove and the long dark wait for spring. So she burned everything else. The wooden bucket, the spare shelf, the broken wagon wheel she had meant to repair. She pulled planks from the goat shed roof until the poor animal stood shivering beneath an open sky, and then she brought the goat inside the cabin, where it slept beside the stove and added its thin animal warmth to the desperate arithmetic of survival. Still, the winter grew harder. By the second week of January, the snow outside the cabin door rose past Karen's knees. The wind blew without mercy, hammering the window with frozen grit. Food dwindled to a handful of dried beans, a small sack of oats she had been stretching for weeks, and the last of the salted pork that was now green with age. Milk from the goat kept her weak body functioning, but just barely. Biscuit grew thin, his ribs visible beneath his matted coat, and the piano sat untouched in the corner, a dark monument to a promise Karen was no longer sure she could keep. She thought often of her mother's final words, whispered in the upstairs room of the boarding house in St. Louis 3 years ago, her mother's hand gripping Karen's wrist with the last strength she possessed. The piano is all I have left to give you. There's more inside than music. Promise me you'll never let them take it. Promise me you'll never burn it. Karen had promised. She was 19 then, full of hope and the certain belief that hardship was something that happened to other people. Now, at 29, she understood what her mother had really been asking. The promise wasn't about the piano. It was about faith. Faith that the instrument held a value beyond its weight in firewood. Faith that honoring the dead mattered more than feeding the living. Faith that she would never have to choose between the two. But faith was becoming a luxury she could not afford. The crisis arrived on the night of January 18th. The temperature dropped so suddenly that the cabin logs cracked like gunshots. The stove struggled to hold heat, burning through the last split pieces of the goat shed roof in under 2 hours. Karen sat wrapped in every blanket she owned, her back against the piano, Biscuit and the goat huddled against her. The cold seeped through the walls like water through a cracked dam. Her fingers went numb. Her breath formed pale ghosts in the air. She looked at the rosewood cabinet gleaming dully in the lantern light, and for the first time since her mother's death she allowed herself to think the unthinkable. Her hand reached for the axe leaning beside the stove. The wood had weight. The blade was dull but sufficient. Karen stood slowly, the blankets falling from her shoulders. She touched the piano lid, felt the smooth curve of the polished rosewood. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, but it was growing fainter, drowned out by the screaming of the wind and the thudding of her own terrified heart. She raised the axe. Then a voice cut through the storm, sharp and clear as a bell. Karen! Karen Locke, you open this door. Karen froze, the axe hovering in the air. She knew that voice. It belonged to Silas Tanner, the one man in Trail Hollow who had more reason than anyone to want that piano reduced to kindling. And he was not alone. The jingle of harness bells and the stamp of hooves announced a loaded sleigh pulled up outside. Silas hammered the door with his fist. I know you're in there, and I know what you're about to do. Put down the axe. I've got a proposition that'll save your life without burning a single ivory key. Karen's grip tightened on the handle. Through the frost-covered window, she could see the dark shape of a horse and the glow of a lantern swinging in the blizzard. Silas Tanner had spent the last 3 months telling anyone who would listen that Karen's piano was a bad omen. Why in God's name had he come out in the middle of a killing storm to stop her from destroying it? The axe trembled in her hand. The piano waited, silent and patient, as if it had known all along that this moment would arrive. Karen pulled open the door and Silas Tanner stepped inside, shaking the snow from his buffalo coat. He was a wiry man of 50 with a hard jaw and eyes that had looked at hardship and never blinked. For months, he had been the loudest voice in Trail Hollow, telling anyone who would listen that Corinne's piano was a waste of good firewood, a monument to stubbornness that would kill her before spring. Now he stood in her cabin, breathing the thin warmth and staring at the axe still trembling in her grip. "I know what I said before," he said without waiting for invitation. "I told folks you'd freeze because of that thing. I wasn't wrong about the danger, but I was wrong about why." He unbuttoned his coat and pulled from a pocket a folded paper, the edges dark with water stains. "Your husband John borrowed $37 from me 2 winters ago. He offered the piano as security, put it in writing. I've been wanting that piano ever since, not for music, for revenge." Corinne felt the cold rush of a buried secret rising into her chest. She had never known about the debt. John had never mentioned it before he died. Silas held out the paper. "When I heard you were burning everything to stay alive, I figured you'd give up and let the piano come to me. But you ain't given up. And I watched you haul that goat inside and burn your mother's hope chest, and I saw a thing I didn't expect. A woman who keeps a promise when it's killing her." He folded the note and shoved it back into his coat. "I'm tearing up this claim. The piano is yours, free of debt, but that ain't the proposition." Corinne lowered the axe, her breath still misting in the cabin air. The goat bleated softly behind her, and Biscuit's tail thumped once against the floor. Silas gestured at the rosewood case. "You can't eat it, you can't burn it, but you can make it work. I got 3 granddaughters who live 2 miles north. They ain't never heard a proper tune. I'll trade you 1 rick of split oak per month, plus a sack of cornmeal every second week, if you teach them to play. Other families will follow. Your piano stops being dead weight and becomes a living." That was how the lessons began. On the morning of January 20th, 3 girls arrived in a sleigh bundled so thick they could barely move their arms. Their names were Hattie, Cora, and little Ellen Tanner, and they stared at the rosewood piano as if it had fallen from the moon. Corinne sat them on the bench, placed their small chapped fingers on the ivory keys, and began teaching scales while the wind moaned outside. The sound that rose from the instrument was thin and cold stiff, but it was music, and music meant more than heat. It meant something still alive in the dead heart of winter. Word spread faster than fire. Within 2 weeks, 5 other families sent children, each offering what they could spare: birch logs, dried beans, a piece of salt pork, a tin of tea from a previous year. Corinne drew a chart on a scrap of burlap pinned to the wall, marking out lesson times for 9 students across the week. The piano that had nearly become kindling now functioned as a strange kind of furnace, one that did not consume itself but generated fuel by remaining whole. The house grew slightly warmer. The goat gave enough milk to share with the youngest students. Biscuit began to fill out again, his ribs softening beneath a regrowing coat. But the same success that saved Corinne's life also sharpened the attention of those who wanted that piano for less honorable reasons. Horace Milner, the storekeeper, watched the parade of children's sleighs with a bitterness that hardened every day. In his mind, the piano was not a tool for survival. It was an asset that belonged in a civilized parlor in Sioux City or Omaha, where a polished rosewood upright could fetch $200 or more. Corinne's little lesson scheme was costing him money, and worse, it was planting hope in the settlement that a woman alone could prosper without his store. By the second week of February, Milner began his campaign. He told customers that the piano was haunted, that Corinne's mother had been a spiritualist who meddled in dark practices back in Missouri. The music coming from that cabin, he whispered, was a spirit calling to children, and anyone who sent their young ones there risked more than frostbite. It was an old frontier tactic, using superstition to isolate the vulnerable, and it worked on 2 families who pulled their sons from lessons without explanation. Corinne felt the loss like a draft through a cracked wall. The wood piles shrank again. Then the weather turned murderous. During the 3rd week of February, a storm system rolled down from the Canadian plains that surpassed everything the Dakota Territory had endured that season. For 4 straight days, the sky became a white sheet that erased the horizon. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, so cold that breath froze in the open air and fell as tiny crystals. The chimney drew poorly, filling the cabin with enough smoke that Corinne had to crack the window despite the cold. The goat's milk ran thin. The piano strings complained, tightening and pinging in the brutal chill. No one came for lessons. The paths vanished under drifts that rose above the windowsill. Corinne was alone again, this time without the hope chest, without the chairs, with only the piano and a dwindling stack of birch logs from the last payment. She sat in the lantern light, running her fingers over the keys without pressing them, as if touching the ivory could summon the heat she needed. It was on the fourth night, with the storm still howling and the last log burning low, that Corinne's memory circled back to her mother's final words. There's more inside than music. She had understood that as a metaphor, a poetic promise that the piano held memory, love, heritage. But sitting in the freezing dark, with no food beyond a handful of oats and no wood beyond a single split pine knot, her mind began to work differently. Her mother had been a precise woman, not given to empty sentiment. She had been a teacher before marrying, a woman who balanced account books for the boarding house. If she said there was more inside, maybe she meant something literal. Corinne took up the lantern and knelt beside the piano, running her hands along the lower panel beneath the keyboard. The rosewood was smooth and seamless, joined with the kind of craftsmanship that left no obvious seams. She pressed along the edges, tapped the bass, checked the back. Nothing moved. Then she remembered a detail from her childhood. Her mother kept a small brass key in a jar of buttons on her dresser, a key that never fit any lock in the house. Corinne had asked about it once, and her mother had smiled and said, "That opens a door you don't need yet." The memory hit her with physical force. The key. She had packed that jar of buttons into the biscuit tin when she burned the Hope chest. In a scramble, she retrieved the tin, poured its contents onto the floor, and there, among the silver thimble and the lock of hair, was a tiny brass key no longer than her thumb. Its bow was shaped like a bird in flight. Her hands shaking from cold and anticipation, Corinne brought the key to the piano and searched for a lock. She found it hidden beneath the music stand, a minute brass plate nearly invisible against the dark wood. The key slid in with a soft click. A panel beneath the keyboard swung outward, revealing a shallow compartment lined with velvet. Inside was a folded document, brittle with age, and a single gold coin. The document was her mother's will, written in her own hand and dated 2 years before her death. It stated that the piano was to go to Corinne, but more importantly, that the dowry her mother had saved across 20 years of service, $500 in federal gold notes, was concealed within the instrument itself. The coin was merely a marker. The real treasure lay deeper, inside a false bottom beneath the compartment. But before Corinne could pry further, a heavy pounding shattered the night. Not the wind this time, a fist against the door. "Corinne Locke, sheriff's business. Open up or we break it down." Horace Milner's voice, oily and triumphant. He had come with a lawman and a claim of debt John had supposedly owed him for store credit. The piano would be seized as payment. Corinne looked at the compartment, at the axe leaning against the stove, at the door shaking under the blows. To reach the money, she would have to split the false bottom with the axe blade, risking the instrument's destruction, the very thing her mother had made her swear never to do. Outside, the storm and the sheriff demanded entry. Inside, the piano held a fortune that could save her from every debt and every winter to come. But accessing it required breaking her promise, the single promise that had kept her alive through the darkest months. The axe was in her hand before she could think. The piano, silent and patient, waited for her to decide which kind of survival mattered more. Corinne slid the brass key into her pocket and closed the hidden panel without a sound. The axe remained at her feet as she crossed the cabin and pulled open the door, the storm blasting snow across the threshold. Sheriff McCready stood beneath the overhang, a heavy man with frost already whitening his mustache. Behind him, Horace Milner held a lantern high, the light carving his gloating face from the dark. "Mrs. Locke, I've got a lien writ against the property of your late husband," McCready said flatly. "Horace here claims John owed $42 for flour, salt, corn, and sundries from the last 2 years. The paper been filed proper at the county seat in Yankton." I'm here to secure an asset to cover the debt. That piano will do. Corinne blocked the doorway, Biscuit pressing against her leg. You're not touching it. Milner stepped forward, his teeth showing. The widow's been burning every stick of wood in this claim, Sheriff. The piano is the only thing worth seizing. She can't refuse. Corinne lifted the folded will from her pocket, holding it in the lantern glow. My mother left me this instrument with the instruction that it never be sold, seized, or destroyed. John never owned it. The debt is not mine. Macready took the paper, squinting at the careful handwriting. He read slowly, his lips moving, while wind howled through the gap between the cabin and the sleigh. Milner's face tightened. This don't prove the piano holds any value beyond sentiment, Milner said. She's been telling folks it's got some kind of inheritance hidden inside. If that's true, then the court has a right to it as part of the estate. Corinne felt the key against her thigh, the secret burning. The only thing inside this piano has already saved my life. It's music, and it's keeping children fed and warm. As if summoned, the sound of harness bells jingled through the blizzard. Silas Tanner's sleigh pulled up, and with him came 3 other neighbors who had sent children for lessons, Elias and Martha Bybee, and a Norwegian homesteader named Oskar Lindgren whose son had learned 2 hymns that month. Silas climbed down, his buffalo coat stiff with ice. Horace Milner, you lying worm, Silas said without preamble. I watched you write that same fake lien for the Johnson widow 3 winters ago. You've been bleeding people dry with store debts nobody remembers signing. Macready turned slowly. You got proof of that, Tanner. Silas pulled a worn notebook from inside his coat. I keep my own accounts. John Locke paid his store bill in full 18 months ago with 10 bushels of wheat and a breeding ewe. I witnessed the transaction myself and wrote it down. He flipped to a page and extended it toward Macready. The sheriff studied the entry, then looked at Milner. Milner's lantern trembled. That book is worthless. It's his word against my filed paper. But Macready's posture had shifted. He handed the will back to Corinne and pocketed the lien writ. I'll hold this matter until the spring court session at Yankton. Until then, the piano stays where it is. Both of you give your testimony under oath when the trail's clear. He climbed onto his horse and vanished into the blowing snow without another word. Milner lingered by the door. He leaned close to Corinne, his voice low and venomous. You think you've won something tonight, but spring court is 3 months away. I'll have another lien by then and another after that. You'll spend every penny you don't have fighting me. That piano will end up in my warehouse whether you burn it first or not. He turned and stormed toward his sleigh. Before he could leave, Corinne spoke. You said there was money inside this piano. You were right. She let the pause stretch. My mother left me a fortune in gold notes. The key is in my hand. But I made her a promise never to break this instrument open, and I intend to keep it. If you force me into court, I will use every cent to bury you in legal fees before you touch a single ivory key. Milner froze, the reins slack in his grip. The lantern light flickered across his face, and for a single instant Corinne saw not greed but calculation. He hadn't known about the gold. He had only repeated gossip. Now he had a new problem. If the piano truly held a fortune, the legal battle might cost him more than the instrument was worth. He drove off in silence, the sleigh vanishing into the curtain of snow. Silas helped Corinne bar the door again after the others had gone. You weren't bluffing about the money, he said quietly. Corinne shook her head. My mother hid it in a false bottom. I found the compartment tonight, but I need to open it without destroying the piano. If I smash it, I break my promise. And right now, that promise is the only thing keeping me alive. She spent the remainder of that winter rebuilding. The lessons resumed in the second week of March, when the drifts began to soften and the sun lingered a few minutes longer each evening. More families sent children than before, not just for music but because Corinne Locke had stood up to Horace Milner and a sheriff in the longest winter in memory, and she had not broken. The woodpiles rose again outside the cabin. Milk came back into the goat. Biscuit fattened on scraps and followed Corinne wherever she walked, a caramel shadow against the melting snow. But the question of the hidden money never left her mind. On clear afternoons after lessons, while the children's sleigh bells faded down the trail, Corinne sat at the piano and studied every joint and seam of the rosewood case. Her mother had been a precise woman. If she'd built a hidden compartment, she would have built a way to open it without force. There had to be a mechanism. Then one evening in late March, when the first trickle of snowmelt ran beneath the cabin and the air smelled of wet earth, Corinne remembered something. As a child, she had watched her mother sit at this very piano and play a peculiar sequence of 3 chords before opening the keyboard lid. A flat D minor, G minor. Her mother had always played them fast, as if clearing dust, and then the lid would lift. Corinne had never thought anything of it. Every pianist had their ritual. But now, sitting alone in the lamplight, she placed her fingers on the keys and pressed those 3 chords exactly as her mother had. Nothing happened. The lid remained shut. She tried them again, this time harder with the pedal pressed. The sound rippled through the instrument, and somewhere deep inside, a faint click echoed, barely audible, like a latch sliding free. Corinne stared at the panel beneath the keyboard. A thin line had appeared along the lower edge where no seam had been visible before. She pressed it, and the false bottom swung open without resistance. Inside lay a stack of federal gold notes, bound with a faded ribbon, exactly $500. Beneath them sat a second document, a deed for a quarter section of land near the Vermilion River, purchased by her mother in 1873 and registered in Corinne's name. It was prime bottomland, worth 4 times the piano's weight in gold. Her mother had not merely hidden savings. She had secured a future that could sustain Corinne for the rest of her life, a future that required only the courage to keep a promise through the darkest winter of her soul. Corinne sat on the cold floor, the notes and deed in her lap, and for the first time since John's burial, she allowed herself to cry. The piano loomed above her, dark and patient, its strings humming softly with the vibration of her breath. It had saved her once with the lessons that kept her warm. Now it had saved her again with a fortune that would free her forever from Horace Milner and every man like him. What she didn't yet realize, kneeling on that cabin floor, was that the second salvation had only just begun. Because Horace Milner was on his way to Yankton to file a claim that would test the strength of a dead woman's promise against the full machinery of frontier law. Spring arrived in Trail Hollow like a debt collector who had finally found the address. The thaw began in the last week of March, unsealing the rivers and turning the roads into rivers of mud. Corinne Locke packed her biscuit tin of keepsakes, the key around her neck, and $40 of the gold notes from the piano into a leather pouch stitched inside her dress. The rest of the fortune stayed hidden in the compartment, exactly where her mother had placed it 13 years earlier. She would not touch another cent until a judge in Yankton declared the piano legally hers. Silas Tanner drove her east in his freight wagon, the journey taking 5 days along rutted trails still slushy with snowmelt. Elias Bybee and the Norwegian Oskar Lindgren rode alongside, ready to testify. Horace Milner had filed his formal lien just as he threatened, but this time he had upped the stakes. The new filing claimed that John Locke had not only owed $42 in store credit, but had also given Milner a promissory note for $200 signed over as full title to the Rosewood piano. The note was dated 3 weeks before John's death. Corinne had never heard of it, and the signature on the paper was entirely unfamiliar. Someone had forged a dead man's hand. Milner was gambling everything on the belief that a frontier widow would crumble before the machinery of the law, and that no judge in Dakota Territory would take the word of a woman over a notarized document. He was wrong about the judge. Judge Augustus Whitfield presided over the Yankton Circuit Court, a gaunt Presbyterian from Pennsylvania who had spent 10 years riding the territorial bench. He had seen every type of frontier fraud and had sent more than one unscrupulous merchant to the territorial prison at Bismarck. Whitfield listened to both sides in silence, his hands folded on the desk. Milner produced his promissory note, the ink brown with age, and a witness named Felix Crane, a drifter who claimed he had watched John Locke sign the paper over a bottle of whiskey. Silas Tanner produced his ledger with the entry showing John's debt cleared. The Bybees testified that John had never mentioned any store debt beyond the ordinary. Oskar Lindgren, speaking in careful English, described Milner's habit of inventing debts against widows who could not read contracts. Then the judge turned to Corinne. "Mrs. Locke, you claim the piano is yours by maternal inheritance, not part of your husband's estate. Can you produce any evidence that the instrument was your mother's and not your husband's to pledge?" Corinne rose from the hard wooden bench. "I can do better than produce a paper, Your Honor. The piano itself can testify." She had arranged for the instrument to be brought into the courtroom an hour earlier, hauled on a flatbed cart by Silas and Oscar while the trial was in recess. It now stood against the wall, dark and imposing. Corinne walked to it, her fingers tracing the rosewood grain. "My mother was a precise woman. She built this piano to guard its secret, and she taught me that secret when I was a child, though I didn't understand it until this winter." She sat on the bench, her worn dress pooling around her on the polished wood. The courtroom fell silent. She pressed the first chord, a flat, then D minor, then G minor. Under her feet the floor vibrated with the resonance. Nothing visible happened. A faint smile touched Milner's lips. "A nice recital, Mrs. Locke, but hardly evidence." Corinne ignored him, pressing the keys again more deeply, this time holding the final chord with the pedal. The sound bloomed, and from inside the piano case came a sharp mechanical click, loud enough to echo from the courtroom walls. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, a soft melody began to play, not from the keys or the strings, but from a hidden music box mechanism inside the cabinet, tinkling a fragile lullaby that Corinne had not heard since her mother had sung her to sleep beside a Missouri fireplace. The lower panel beneath the keyboard swung open on its own, revealing the velvet-lined compartment. Inside, visible to the entire courtroom, gleamed the remaining gold notes and the deed to the Vermilion River land. Judge Whitfield leaned forward. "What is that sound?" Corinne's voice wavered, but she kept it steady. "It's my mother's music box, the one she built into the piano when she was a young woman. The chords are the key, and the tune is the lock. She taught me the sequence before she died, and I promised to never let anyone take this piano from me." She lifted the document from the compartment and held it up. "This deed was registered in my name in 1873. I was 12 years old. My mother planned for this instrument to provide for me long after she was gone. It could not have been pledged by my husband because it was never his." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Felix Crane slipped out the back door and was not seen again in Yankton. Milner's face drained to the color of old chalk. Judge Whitfield examined the deed and the will, then looked at Milner's promissory note with fresh eyes. "Mr. Milner, the signature on this note does not match any of the verified documents from John Locke's hand in the county land office. Moreover, this piano is clearly not a simple piece of furniture. It is a legal trust of inheritance, with a mechanism that only the rightful heir could operate. I find the lien fraudulent and the promissory note a forgery. This court rules in favor of Corinne Locke and awards her full title to the rosewood piano and all its contents." He fixed Milner with a cold stare. "You may expect a visit from the territorial prosecutor." Silas Tanner let out a bark of laughter. The Bybys clasped hands. Corinne sat motionless on the bench, one hand still resting on the keys, the music box tinkling its final notes into silence. When the courtroom emptied, she remained, her forehead pressed against the cool rosewood, whispering words her mother could never hear but had always known would be spoken. The journey home took 5 days in gentle spring weather, the prairie blooming with early wildflowers. Corinne rode in the wagon with the piano once again lashed securely behind her, its secret now known to the world but its value undiminished. When the cabin came into view, Biscuit raced down the trail to meet her, the goat bleating from the doorway. 3 months earlier, she had stood in that same cabin holding an axe over the piano, ready to destroy it for a single night of warmth. Now the instrument had unlocked a future she had never imagined. She returned to Trail Hollow as the legal owner of a half-section of Prime River land, with more than $400 in gold remaining, and a music school that had already educated 15 children through the bitterest season any of them had known. But the second salvation of the piano went deeper than money. Horace Milner's business collapsed within the month. The territorial prosecutor, acting on Judge Whitfield's referral, uncovered a pattern of fraudulent liens stretching back 7 years. Milner's store was seized and sold at auction. The Trail Hollow settlement, freed from the grip of his greed, began to trade with a new cooperative that Silas Tanner organized. Karen, now secure on land of her own, taught music for the next 30 years. The Rosewood piano became a gathering point for the community, played at barn weddings, holiday services, and the quiet evenings when the wind howled outside and the music inside reminded everyone that winter could be endured. The promise she had made to her mother, a promise that had nearly killed her, had instead saved her twice. First, by giving her the means to exchange music for firewood, and second, by delivering the fortune hidden within the very instrument she had refused to burn. What Karen never told anyone was that when she finally examined the hidden music box, she found a third item her mother had placed beneath the gold notes, a small photograph of herself as a child, seated at the piano with her mother's hands guiding her fingers. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "The music will keep you warm, the secret will keep you free." The piano had delivered both. And as spring turned to summer in 1880, the sound of scales and sonatas drifting from Karen Locke's cabin became a quiet defiance that outlasted every storm. The Rosewood piano stayed with Karen Locke for the rest of her life. It survived more bitter winters, more howling storms, more years than any piece of furniture had a right to endure on the frontier. Its hidden compartment, emptied of the gold notes and the deed, still held the tiny music box that only she could summon with 3 chords. Students came and went, grew up, married, and sent their own children to sit on the creaking bench and learn scales. The cabin eventually became known less as a home and more as an institution, the Locke School of Music, though it remained exactly what it had always been. One woman, one instrument, and the refusal to let either be destroyed. When Karen passed away in the spring of 1910, at the age of 60, the piano was donated to the new schoolhouse in Trail Hollow, where it stood for another 40 years. Children who had never known a winter without coal heat or store-bought coats learned to play on ivory keys that had once nearly fed a stove. The town never forgot that the school's first teacher had been a widow who burned her own chairs before she would harm a promise. But the question that lingers isn't about the gold or the land or even the music. It's about what actually kept Karen Locke alive during those darkest months. The money was there all along, but she didn't know it. The legal protection was there, but a courtroom lay 100 miles away through impassable snow. What she had, in the moment of greatest danger, was a single promise made to a dying mother, and the inexplicable faith that honoring it mattered more than warming her hands for one night. We are taught to value what can be seen: bank accounts, deeds, the wood you can stack against the wall. Karen's story suggests something else. Sometimes the most important asset is invisible. Sometimes it's a promise you refuse to sell, even when selling it would save your life. And sometimes the very thing you spare from the fire becomes the heat that sustains you. So I ask you, was it the hidden fortune that truly saved Karen Locke, or was it the promise itself? Could you stand in a freezing cabin with an axe in your hands and still choose loyalty over survival? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe that the strongest things in this world are not always the ones you can touch, hit subscribe. We'll be back with another story that proves the past still has secrets worth uncovering.